Hello! Hi everyone. Welcome to our digital summit on To Carbon or Not to Carbon. We have three experts which will give us our insights on the advantages and disadvantages of having a carbon-centered narrative around the climate crisis, previously known as climate change. So it's my pleasure to introduce our three speakers. First, we have Camila. And well, actually, this digital summit was first inspired on a text in which Camila was an author. So I think we're quite lucky to have her here to share her perspectives live. And there's probably been new insights since she wrote this text. And she is a researcher and an active member of civil society networks in Brazil and in Latin America. And she holds a PhD in sociology. And she's also part of the Heinrich Böll Institute. She has been a member of the Brazilian delegation in climate change negotiations in 2008. The text that I'm referring to is called Carbon Metrics, Global Extractions and Ecological Pesticide. And, well, welcome, Camila. We also have Jürgen Bauhaus. He is the head of silviculture in the University of Freiburg. And finally, we have Nathalie Seddon. She is a professor at Oxford with over 20 years experience in biodiversity and ecology in the Latin American and the Afrotropics. And she started an initiative called the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, which is looking to incorporate nature more into the climate narrative. So, with further ado, I would like our three speakers to just give an introduction to their point of view on this topic, to carbon or not to carbon around the climate narrative. Camila, could you start?
Okay, so I have, 5 minutes?
Yes, around 5 minutes. And
okay.
Our audience is welcome to ask questions as our speakers give their views. So we encourage you to question what they're saying, and so that we can have a very lively discussion and conversation throughout this digital summit.
Okay, so almost like 5 years ago, we finally got written and articulated a critique of the carbon reductionism and the carbon-centered discourse that we call carbon metrics. That is overwhelming, and it's how on the very basis on which the current climate crisis has been framed. So I think to make it very short, the main point is to confront, to challenge the naturalistic fallacy that numbers are hard facts. So it's very important to remember that as carbon is a global abstraction that has been created recently and it's becoming all pervasive, the very metric system was once upon a time invented, created by humans, as it was the GDP. And it becomes very deeply wired into our own system in how we define our subjectivity. It becomes a rationality in itself. For instance, try to discuss today nutrition without reaching out to calories. Try to define yourself without reaching out to, I have 1 meter, 54 centimeters. So all those abstractions, they become part of a common, a universal, a pretense universal reason. So what we challenge is that to make carbon a unit that you can see, you can measure, and you can talk and communicate, you rely on a massive technological infrastructure. Without digitalization, without satellites, without the massive amount of new infrastructure that is being, green infrastructure that is being sold to countries, we cannot make sense out of carbon. We cannot dispute if either agroecology or agribusiness are more green or climate friendly if we don't have the climate models to calculate. And what worries us mostly is that this is not a scientific issue. It has fusion with a political agenda. Today, you can look of what are the demands of, for instance, Fridays for Future or Extinction Rebellion, just to name more recent climate movements. And they all have at their number one demand decarbonization of the economy, be it on 2030 or whatever. But the point is, within the Paris Agreement, decarbonization, although it's not named this way, refers to a net reduction, a net effect. And the net here is problematic because we have carbon as a metric, and we accept that carbon is a fungible unit, that we can convert methane emissions, for instance, into carbon. But regions in the world have different mitigation potentials because we have photosynthesis that happens very differently in the Amazon and in Siberia. So this supposes that some areas of this planet are going to be more cost effective to decarbonize the world. And this creates a lot of imbalances. On the top of that, we are advancing with very problematic ideas of creating carbon markets or trade of internationally tradable mitigation outcomes, where carbon in itself it's criticized, and then it starts to give room to gourmet carbon, where you transform biodiversity or gender or human rights in some kind of co-benefits to carbon. So we see that this is framing a very problematic future where all kinds of rival forms of knowledge to the carbon reductionist discourse are being erased out of the way that we can communicate. Because even if now we can have this conversation here among people that are willing to think differently, in the climate policy, in the Green Climate Fund, this is not possible, At the end of the day, everything is reduced to carbon only.
Great. Thank you very much, Camila. That was very in short, very clear of the view of, when you just think about carbon as a unit and you forget everything else that is around it, it can be problematic in the way we generally think. And I agree with that. And with this, we move on to Jürgen Bauhaus. I think your insight will be very, very interesting regarding on how you see that carbon can be managed within Europe, which is a particular context when we think in the global scale. So Jürgen, could you please enlighten us?
I will try to. Thank you. I found this opening remark quite interesting. Camila, I would have less of an issue with using carbon as a metric, because as a natural scientist, of course, I find it very valuable when we actually have a common currency to compare things. I think it is important to, for example, compare things to see which ones can be implemented most efficiently, or with the greatest benefit with regards to that goal. I have more an issue with the narrow focus or the single-minded focus of carbon. To me, forests, most forests in this world are multifunctional. They're not unifunctional forests. Even simple plantations, monospecific plantations, have more than one function. In addition to sequestering carbon in the biomass in the soil, they have an influence on hydrological cycles. Even simple plantations have benefits for biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So by simply focusing on one goal, we will never optimize the delivery of the wide spectrum of ecosystem services that we want to obtain from whatever forests in a local or regional context. Let me take my country as an example. In the second half of the last century, we had basically a paradigm for forest management, which translates into the wake theory. What it basically means is that all the other forest functions will be automatically fulfilled if we manage our forests properly for profitability. Yeah? And that kind of theory has been thrown overboard several decades ago, because people found out it doesn't make sense now to have focus on a single function, because it is, of course, very naive to assume that all the other functions would somehow follow suit and will be adequately provided. And it is therefore for me actually quite surprising to see that, against this experience that we have with the deficiencies of this single-minded folky, that we establish again single-minded or single folky for management, such as for carbon only or for biodiversity only. That's where I have the problem. And the other problem that I have then in particular is when we talk about climate action, that our focus is often too narrowly on mitigation effects. There is no mitigation in the long term without adaptation. And there are enough examples where we have to actually make compromises today with regards to mitigation if we want to have forests adapted in the long term. The forests, for example, in Germany are at a record high of carbon stocks in our forests. They are so high that we actually have problems regenerating some of the more light demanding tree species, which happen also to be the ones that are most adapted to the climate of the future. So we have already at the moment a trade-off. If we continue to increase our carbon stocks, we will actually have large problems adapting the forests to future conditions and provide the wide variety of ecosystem services. And adequately, or similarly to what Camilla has already pointed out, there are very clear trade-offs or actually lack of synergies between the carbon goal and other goals. There's been a very nice recent study that looked at the relationship in European forests between carbon stocks and biodiversity. And that's often repeated argument that if you reserve carbon stocks, you'll also do something good for biodiversity. For European deciduous forests, the relationship is not existent. There are some species that benefit, but you have as many species that actually are negatively affected by increasing carbon storage. So overall, there's zero effect. The only way you can actually deal with this problem is to have different kinds of solutions in different parts of the landscapes. There may be parts in the landscapes where you can create a lot of benefits by increasing carbon in forests, but there are also parts in the landscape where you actually have negative effects on other ecosystem functions. So we have to, I think, keep our focus broad on all ecosystem services and have to see where carbon actually can promote other ecosystem services and use it there. But we also have to be mindful where the focus on carbon storage and mitigation actually has trade-offs for other important ecosystem functions. I'll leave it there.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jürgen. So you mentioned one very important point of the multifunctionality and the fact that right now biodiversity and carbon, so climate change talk, are quite disintegrated. You have CBD and then you have the UNFCCC. So I think, Natalie, now, I think it would be a very good insight from you to let us know what approaches are being done to integrate these two aspects, biodiversity and the climate narrative.
Okay, I'm very happy to comment on that. And I'm just going to say a few words addressing the main question, then perhaps in discussions we can talk about all the momentum there is now in terms of linking those processes, as there is a great deal, and that's a really important thing that's happening over the next 12 months in the build up to the 2020 CBD COP and COP26. But I just want to talk a little bit more about the specific question raised and my steer for this, my contribution today. So Al Gore is very fond of saying that the greatest carbon dioxide removal technology that we have is a tree, and that taken to scale, this is basically a forest. And as we are aware, there is now an enormous amount of excitement in business, in government, and international agreements about the potential of forests to help us reach net zero emissions. On the one hand, this is really good news, as nature is indeed, I believe, our greatest ally in the fight against climate change and many other global challenges. And I believe that all businesses, governments, development organizations, and citizens need to recognize and act on this, and this is starting to happen. On the other hand, as the previous, my colleagues who previously spoke have mentioned, great caution is warranted. And I think there are 4 major reasons for this. We need to be clear what we mean by forest. You know, not all forests, not all tree species are equal when it comes to the benefits that they bring to societies. And we need to really draw on the rich ecological and indigenous understandings of how forest functions and how those forest functions are impacted by change over time. We need to bear this in mind when we design and implement these natural climate solutions. In particular, we have to ensure that the emphasis is really on restoring and protecting rich, natural, biodiverse old growth forests through local stewardship. The science is very clear that they store, over the long term, much more carbon, they are much more biodiverse, and they're much more resilient. And I want to come back a bit to the relationship between resilience and biodiversity and talk a little bit about what Jürgen was saying about the relationship between carbon and biodiversity. We really have to avoid scaling up afforestation with single species and with non-native species. And a lot of climate change policy is basically promoting large-scale monoculture plantations. These are very low resilience and they risk compromising local land rights. So even if you are only really keen on carbon, you want resilient carbon. And in a rapidly changing world, that means increasing the diversity of plantations or supporting naturally diverse old-growth forests. The second thing we need to really always bear in mind is that we have to ensure that forest doesn't replace other valuable ecosystems that are as rich or even more rich in either above ground carbon or in soil carbon, and which are also rich in biodiversity. So I'm thinking about mangroves, peatlands, ancient grasslands. These are all very rich in many of the things we need, including securing carbon, sequestering carbon. And in some parts of the world, actually, these ecosystems may be more resilient than forests. So we must make sure that all this enthusiasm for forests as a solution to climate change mitigation doesn't come at the cost of other very valuable ecosystems. The other important thing is that we have to ensure that in promoting the value of our ecosystems for dealing with the drivers of climate change, we don't curtail or detract from the fundamental need to keep fossil fuels in the ground and to decarbonize our economy. Natural climate solutions are not an alternative to those, they're a complement. And finally, this really reflects on what was said by the previous speaker, by Jürgen. We mustn't forget about the other ecosystem services. You know, in our drive to harness natural ecosystems to slow warming, we must not lose sight of their essential role in supporting human adaptation. You know, by prioritizing a variety of ecosystems and promoting their resilience to ensure reliable and resilient mitigation services, we will also secure the flow of a whole suite of ecosystem services that are vital for adaptation. We know that habitats and watersheds can secure and regulate water supplies and protect from flooding and soil erosion, that mangroves, reefs and salt marshes protect us from storm surges, saltwater intrusion and coastal erosion. And we know that things like agroforestry can maintain and enhance yields in dry and more variable climates. And moreover, there are many economic benefits of these nature-based adaptation solutions, especially through avoided losses through climate change-related disasters. In other words, the point I'm really wanting to make is that restoring and protecting nature really isn't just about storing carbon and slowing warming. It's also about cost-effective protection of ecosystems to help shield us from floods, from droughts, from landslides and storms, heat waves and other disasters that are increasingly common under climate change. You know, Jürgen highlights the importance of not focusing on single issues. There are many trade-offs, and this is a really important consideration. Ultimately, what we want to be doing is promoting a way of working with nature in such a way that ecosystems continue supporting human development and well-being in the face of change. Okay. Thanks.
Right, perfect. Thank you so much, Natalie. So we see that focusing on carbon has caused issues such as like having monocultives of the same tree species. So they're not necessarily rich forests. They are just forests that can store carbon quickly. And well, some of the issues that come from this have been spoken of during this digital summit. But clearly carbon has been a very effective way of communicating the initial climate talk, because it is quite easy to, to report how many tons of carbon a country has mitigated. So I can understand that this has been a reason why the climate change, the climate crisis narrative has been focused on carbon. But now that we know the issues that have come from this focus, how, based on your experience, so the first question would be, has this narrative changed in high-level negotiations? And has this actually like filtered through to how countries are doing their climate change policies? And secondly, if it hasn't, or if it hasn't done so fast enough, especially for the general public, because I feel the general public still thinks about, carbon emissions, like everything with, so that's like turning off my car or planting a tree, doesn't matter what tree it is. How can we start to change this narrative so that it's more holistic, that we understand that climate change is related to nature in general, to the well-being of the natural part of planet Earth? So would any of the speakers like to begin to comment on that and also build on the comments of the other speakers? Do we have a hand? Maybe Camila?
I don't know. I find it really hard to engage, because the idea is to question how we are imposing historically, in this historical moment, one global metric. I challenge. I'm coming from philosophy. That's my background. And so we have invented politically the metric system, and it was imposed all over the world, not because it was more efficient to measure things, but because there was a relation of power. The metric system was the quintessential invention of French colonialism, and it was essential to globalize trade. Different societies, different people all over the world have measured and have done barter and trade, local trade, regional trade, without having the need to have one global measure. So now we have this global measure being invented, being imposed forcefully, because otherwise you are out of the economic game. You cannot engage in the multilateral system. But differently from the kilo, where at least you had a scale and a kilo, now we rely on a digital infrastructure to commodify and to measure something that is intangible, a carbon unit. And more than being intangible, it's fungible with different other things. So, for instance, when we talk about ecosystem services, there are a lot of people in the global south and in the north that do not accept this idea that we can transform nature into the economic neoliberal rationality. We cannot talk about services and nature as like a global industry, or this is a different way of thinking. And I really would like to engage in a conversation where people would acknowledge that this is not universal. It's being forged as a universal conversation, but it's not. It's one way of thinking, of seeing the world in terms of efficiency, in terms of net effect, which is not science at all, because you cannot offset a problem in the Amazon, compensating in Papua New Guinea. I'm sorry, localize it cannot be abstracted. So I don't know. I find it that this is something that continuously being kind of putting under the rug, under the how do you say it? Sorry, my English is gone today. But in a very short while, we will have only people who will be born in a world that is being carbon binded. It's like today to question the metric system. Nobody questions anymore because we are born under it.
Right. Thanks, Camila. Jürgen, do you have something to say?
I can see, the problems that you raise. I'd like to hear what solution you have for that. After all, climate change and climate mitigation is a global problem. Yeah, of course, it needs many local and regional solutions, but it is a global problem. And the efforts to solve the problem are negotiated globally and regionally. And it is important for the transparency of the efforts that people take, to have some kind of currency. It is important to have a kind of currency to quantify, the commitments and the achievements of goals that different countries or regions have put forward for climate mitigation. I'd like to hear what you propose as an alternative.
I also think it would be interesting. Yeah, please go ahead.
No. We do have proposals, but they're not on the table. For instance, we talking about monocultures, we could discuss really what is the trade regime that is being left untouched in the negotiations, because we keep promoting, for instance, more and more low carbon agriculture. And we have packages of solutions now coming out of BASF, out of Syngenta, BASF, Hubbard, Monsanto. But we never question to slow down trade, to reverse massively the level of consumption that is being spread all over the world as a universal right. And actually, it's a very imperial mode of living. We could question, the expansion of eucalyptus tree plantations, but this actually is promoted as a solution. We could question the expansion of biofuels, but this is promoted as a solution to keep, the system and the unsustainable cities functioning. So it's a different way to see the world. I think smart cities are not a solution. We should ask how we could dismantle cities. But again, this is a counter rationality, because we are trying to fix this world, not to propose a different world, another world that would be possible.
But if I just may very briefly, I can see the very well justified critique towards perverse outcomes. Of looking at this one currency, and there may be many different additional criteria that we need to have to assess these developments. I totally agree, but I still believe that we need to have a common currency to actually evaluate and compare some climate mitigation efforts.
Natalie?
Lots and lots to pick up on there. Of course, we need to do everything, don't we? We need to both change the world, change individuals' behavior. We need a complete change in the zeitgeist of our relationship with nature, where it becomes central to all decision making, get away from GDP, have a wealth index, national wealth index instead, that is based on natural capital, which encompasses the measurable and also the intrinsic unmeasurable value of nature to societies in different ways. So those are big economic changes in the way we organize our society. And of course, that then has impacts on how we measure, progress towards that and the metrics that we use. We obviously need to change individual behaviors as well. So economic system on one hand and individual behavior. We need massive, big social or socio-ecological tipping points. And dietary change would be the big one that everyone's talking about. And then it really needs to be scaled up massively. But these are very possible solutions. So we need these kind of big fundamental changes. We need to change the world we live in. But we also need to acknowledge some realities, and that is that 80% of the world's population are going to be living in cities by the end of the century. We need to accept that rather than dismantling cities. There's going to be 9, 10, 11 billion people on the planet. Most of them will have to be housed in cities, and we need to make those cities beautiful and green. They need to be full of blue and green infrastructure. They need to have no cars. We need to solve the mobility problem. So we also need to sort of, recognize that those sort of changes are needed and accept that, we don't have very long to do some fairly radical things. I realize that there are regional and cultural differences in how metrics are perceived. The carbon metric is partly popular for those sort of psychological, cognitive, philosophical, historical reasons that you outlined, Camilla. But there is also strong arguments that it is fairly tractable. It can be measured to a certain extent. There is obviously uncertainties, but it can be measured, and it can be measured much more effectively than biosphere integrity, for example, than biodiversity even. And this is one of the issues that we're sort of facing. Obviously, many cultures don't appreciate, putting a value on nature. I personally wish we didn't live in a world where that might, at least in a medium-term future, be a necessity. But we do have data, we do have science and technology that inform the improvement of the ways in which we assess the value of ecosystems and relate that to the value in terms of carbon and all the other ecosystem services.
Great. I think it would be very interesting if we touch upon the issue with carbon markets, which has been also something that has come out of the carbon-centered narrative once again, and it causes what some people would see as inequalities, that as long as you have money, it doesn't matter how much you pollute, right? So I would like you to speak about carbon markets, how you see that they are working, how they are effective, and also how, again, this can be changed, and alternative solutions to this. And finally, I think it's very important that we touch on the RED program, because RED has been very focused on, well, at least from the example of Mexico, our Institute of Ecology and Climate Change has been focusing on getting ready for RED. So measuring everything. So you find all these algorithms to measure carbon, and you're spending all these resources on measuring carbon, but then when does the actual essence of RED, that is, halting deforestation, and when does this actually materialize on the ground? And not in a way that favors monocultures, but that actually favors also biodiversity, counting in carbon. So could you comment on this? Camila?
Oh, me?
Yeah, we'll follow the same order.
Okay, so I'm starting every time. Well, we have been opposing carbon markets since, 2005. And again, back to the very basic assumption that the development of industrial society, which, Natalie, we don't see as a natural trend that people just go to the cities. The historical process has been the enclosure of commons and people being forced to go to the cities. So the point is that we assume that it's a natural phenomenon that by the end of the century, 80% of the population will be to the city. We are neglecting or are refusing to look of how people are being expelled from the rural areas and expropriated from their livelihoods through the advancement of monocultures, of glyphosate, and of big mega dams and etc. All the infrastructure that has been going on, including infrastructure to promote the so-called green energy, which in the case of Brazil, I can tell you that's not that much of a green. So RED has been a big idea that has failed to so far to deliver what it promised. We have opposed it since the beginning because we saw it as paving the way for further privatization of land, for exactly as you were saying, of selling off an infrastructure of consultants, of algorithms, of drones and climate models, all kinds of things you can sell to measure carbon, but not actually something effectively to reverse territorial dynamics of deforestation, as in the case of Brazil. It has been a lot of critique on the RED mechanism, but right now the big trend as the climate agenda is fusioning with this bioeconomy and circular economy is actually to bundle carbon within the commodities. So there's big talk right now about deforestation-free soy, deforestation-free agrofuels, whatever you want to call, because there's also a big trend in promoting this blockchaining carbon into global value chains. So I think it's more and more complicated for us to address carbon and the very climate policy in itself without contextualizing it on a macro scale, what is really driving this process, which is the fourth industrial revolution, the digitalization of the economy, because you cannot separate both things. As Professor was emphasizing, carbon is a currency. And this is what the World Bank has been saying all the time. Carbon is going to be the currency of the 21st century. And I think we should profoundly discuss what this means and what is implication of this for the global economy.
Jürgen?
Well, let me put it first, I'm not an expert on carbon markets. From how I see it, which is from quite a distance, is that the theory of these markets seems to be actually good. But the problem is that, as with so many other markets, it's not an equal playing ground. As you've described for your case in Mexico, it requires a lot of competencies and technical skills and expertise to actually participate in these markets. So it's much easier for large players to enter this market, for example, as buyers, but much more difficult for others to actually enter this market. So I think those people who could actually benefit most from such carbon markets, for example, rural poor people, have basically no access to the market. And that is a fundamental problem of it. And that's one of the reasons why they do not work. And another fundamental reason why they do not work is, of course, that the price for carbon is much too cheap. They haven't been forcefully implemented. When I can only say for the European Union, so many emission certificates have been dished out that it actually doesn't hurt industry. Yeah? So the price for carbon is much too low, and it's not an equal market, not with equal access. These are, in my view, as a layperson, the two most fundamental problems with it.
Perfect. Natalie?
Yeah, similarly, not an expert at all in this, but I share all those concerns, and it would seem to date that it has driven a lot of bad practice across the world, a lot of problems for local people, a lot of problems for biodiversity. And again, people don't think of the resilience of that market and the resilience of those carbon stocks, which supports, we talk about monoculture plantations, but they're just not in a rapidly changing world where you have new diseases and new pathogens and new and unpredictable climatic conditions. That investment is not going to endure over time, and that's not factored in, and that's a real problem that needs addressing. Yeah. So.
All right. Perfect. Now I'm going to read some questions that the audience has asked. So actually, the first one is specifically for Jürgen. And our audience is asking if you can post the name of the European study that you mentioned about a focus on carbon not resulting in trade-offs for biodiversity. So Jürgen, if you wouldn't mind posting it, we have a column on the right side of the screen. So if you don't have it at hand right now, we can always make it accessible later.
Yeah, I'll just mention it. It's a study that was led by Francesco Sabatini, a colleague from Italy, working in Germany at the moment, and it's appeared in Global Change Biology, from this year, and I'll post it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Jürgen. Second question is for all speakers. Could you reflect some more on how we can integrate multiple and different forms of indigenous local forms of value and knowledge to global discourses and policies that require a common currency, for example, carbon measures, and thus some degree of generalization, comparability, and commiserability? You also have access to the question if you would like to take a look at it yourself. So would anyone like to comment on this question of a common currency for indigenous local value knowledge?
Well, I don't think we need a common currency. I'm sorry. I'm more with the Zapatistas. I want a world, un mundo donde quepan muchos mundos. I want a world where we can actually get together and exchange equally, because under the name of a common currency, you are imposing a way of valuing life that it's intrinsically depend of buying a technological package. And if climate crisis was such a crisis, there would be no patents. Those technologies would be distributed immediately for free. But this is not what we see. We see more debt, we see more loans, and we see more dependency being imposed in the South to acquire a technological package to be able and hire consultants to measure, verify, and report to actually prove that we are doing right. So I think there are relations of power that cannot be erased. Again, I insist, and that the science discourse, it's not neutral in this way, because we are talking about very expensive patents, a completely new technological paradigm that is being imposed all over the world.
Right. Would anyone else like to comment on this question?
Not really. I must admit that's really not my field of expertise.
I think just sort of tangentially, really, just to reflect a little bit on the importance of indigenous knowledge about ecosystems in general, about their resilience, about how to manage and restore ecosystems. That is such a rich source of understanding about how we deal with the causes and the consequences of climate change and other global stresses. We don't have time really for all the science to catch up with some of that local knowledge. And of course, we're all aware that we're losing a lot of that local knowledge, that it isn't valued. But when it comes to really sort of understanding the value of ecosystems all over the world, we really need to, and lots of people are working in this space, and lots of people recognize the need to sort of co-create bodies of knowledge and understanding about how to work with ecosystems so that they can continue bringing ecosystem services to different people. Whatever your cognitive mind frame, whatever your worldview, whatever your political orientation, at the end of the day, nature is our life support system, and we need to draw on science and technology and local knowledge and bring that all together in order to understand how to work with it so that it can continue being our life support system, given that there's all these global stresses and global change. And there are various platforms, even within the UN, a new platform for knowledge sharing among policymakers, practitioners, and the indigenous community as well. So their voice isn't loud enough in those negotiations yet, but it is getting louder, and there's certainly a recognition that there's an awful lot of knowledge, and that the value of those resources to those local people needs to be factored in when we try and, it needs to be brought into issues around the carbon market. But this is sort of people have been talking about this and worrying about this for a long time, but there are sort of those channels and platforms increasingly being set up so those knowledge, so that knowledge can be exchanged. But it's an important point. I haven't answered the question, I don't think, at all, because I can't really get my head around the idea of some sort of common currency that integrates those. I just know that we need to draw on all that knowledge and not lose it. And that needs to be a priority, and that needs to be in the narrative and out in the public sphere as well, that understanding that we're not just looking at science to deal with climate change. We're also needing to really learn from Indigenous communities across the world.
Okay. So it's good to know that we're moving in the right direction, and let's just hope that it happens fast enough to integrate everyone in this climate crisis talk. So the next question is, a common forestry argument for focusing afforestation on fast-growing non-native trees is that the resulting timber carbon can be locked up in long-lived wood products like buildings, substituting high-carbon concrete. So what do the speakers think about this argument in theory and in practice?
Well, I think it is important to not only consider forests and the ecosystems, but also the products that they provide. And these products can also have an effect or mitigating effect on climate. It's difficult, extremely difficult to quantify, because you need to have very good life cycle assessments of all the sorts of different products that come from forests. And again, I think few countries actually have good setups there for this kind of accounting. Because it, again, requires a lot of technical expertise, research, and so on and so forth. But I think it is an important contribution. So for my country, Germany, when we look at the mitigation benefits from forests and forest products, we see that these two are, if we didn't have these two benefits, then the total emissions of Germany would be 14% higher than they're now. So the contribution for a highly industrialized country are still quite high. And about half of this actually comes from the products. And yet a lot of the products are actually not very long-lived. There are some recent studies, even from Schellenhuber, from the Potsdam Institute of Climate Impact Research, that say this could be the largest action, or the strongest action that we take, that we really use a lot more timber in buildings, because we could offset so much of the emissions that are associated with the production of concrete and other alternative products. I think the jury is still out, on how large this impact would be. But again, I think if we went that way, the question would be, what other benefits could we catalyze? And are there any detriments associated with this? So I think regarding this argument, we have to look at it carefully, because a lot of fast-growing plantations actually do not provide long-lived products. It depends on the species that are cultivated. These are softwoods that are typically also used to produce building timber, or whether these are hardwoods that are really cultivated for pulpwood or charcoal, which returns to the atmosphere quite quickly. So we have to look at in the specific case and see what it is actually used for. Maybe I rest it there to not take up too much time.
Okay, perfect, thank you. And I think the final question from the audience, I think it's a perfect final question to wrap up. So it's this. What would be the next key steps in integrating carbon with other multifunctional uses of ecosystems, including social aspects, biodiversity, and other ecosystem services? What are the key research political steps to achieving this? So I love this question because it leads us, after we do all this critical thinking around the issues and the problems that have arisen from a carbon-centered narrative, what do we do next? How can we move forward in finding new solutions for climate action? Natalie, I would like if you begin with this, because your initiative, I think it's on point on the way to start thinking differently about climate action?
Yeah, I mean, the key point is one that was raised right at the very beginning. It's just really dangerous to separate carbon from the whole ecosystems that produce or sequester and return carbon to the atmosphere. And I think this much more holistic approach where you look at the whole suite of benefits, you know, carbon sequestration and storage is one of a dozens or more key ecosystem goods and services on which human well-being depends all over the world. And it's really important to right from the outset, when thinking about what targets to put and associated indicators to put in climate change policy, that this all needs to be taken into account. And you need to think about diversity, connectivity, heterogeneity in landscapes. And we need to think about, you know, what landscapes are going to be most resilient. So the only thing we can be certain about the future is increasing uncertainty. And in that context, it just makes a great deal of sense to invest in careful, locally implemented ecosystem stewardship, you know, and to just think about that, and rather than thinking about areas of habitat to plant up or to protect, you think about the quality of those and what those, you know, what can be produced and what's likely to be stable and resilient in a rapidly changing world. So you start off with the premise of what types of research is needed to design the targets and associated indicators that are going to maximize the resilience of our life support system in a rapidly changing world. To start with that, but this is happening. So, for example, we did a big analysis of the extent to which nature was included in the NDC. So these are the climate pledges submitted to the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change by all signatories, outlining their plans for both mitigation and adaptation. And we really focus not on the mitigation, but on the adaptation piece. And it turns out around 66% of signatories do mention or do recognize that nature is an important tool for mitigation and or adaptation. So that's sort of like, actually, you know, it's a lot of the world's countries that acknowledge that ecosystems are important and that they're a powerful tool. However, only a small proportion of them then follow that up with sort of actionable things, actionable targets and intentions. And a majority of those, as we've said, you know, encourage things like afforestation. Not universally. There are many countries of the world that are doing wonderful things and really progressive things, drawing on the science, drawing on the indigenous knowledge. And what we need to do now in terms of next step is really learn from those nations, those regions, those communities that are working from a much more holistic basis. And so I think what's happening now, I mean, this is certainly work that we're and many of our colleagues are involved in, is supporting the revision in the first instance of these nationally determined contributions so that they better reflect science and local understanding of how nature can support ecosystem services and thereby support sustainable development. And climate change is just one part of that. So it's sort of what's the really good thing is that, you know, those involved in the CBD are sort of engaging with, you know, these two big UN conventions, UNFCCC and UNCBD, are that things are coming together. There is a whole series of working groups, expert working groups that are getting together that are building momentum around trying to better, you know, tackle the twin challenges of biodiversity loss and climate change, recognizing that we can't deal with one challenge without also dealing with the other, but also recognizing more broadly that we can't tackle poverty in any long-term and meaningful way without also addressing the climate change and biodiversity crisis. But there's a lot of recognition of this, and there has been for we might argue that there have been decades of recognition, but there's actually a lot of momentum now, especially given all you know, the movement in the public space, and the public support for both nature and dealing with the effects of climate change, whether it's the Friday strikes or Extinction Rebellion. There's a lot of big momentum, and governments are recognizing that. There's lots of work in the research community to do to inform this, but there's even more work, I think, in terms of increasing the uptake in policy. And then, of course, mobilizing all the finance and the governance. A lot needs to change in how we govern our landscapes. And the effects that has on how actual governments are structured and how different ministries and so on collaborate with one another. So there's lots of work to do in research and the finance and the governance around this. But I think we know what the solutions are. We just have to sort of, recognize and tackle those sorts of challenges around governance and finance head on.
I would fully endorse that, along the lines that, forests need to meet multiple functions, and it's a question of integrating all these different perspectives that ensure that they actually do. I don't think we have a shortage of good policies, but a lot of these policies tackle different issues, and they need to be brought together. For example, in Germany, we're in the process of revising a national forest strategy, which actually then includes, very much along the lines that you've outlined, that includes, the climate protection plan, the biodiversity strategy, the bioeconomy strategy, and actually tries to put things together and ask these questions. How can we reconcile that, all of these different good ideas, then to make it work in the forests? So I think we need to have these comprehensive sort of policy approaches that consider all these different perspectives. And they're difficult, they're extremely difficult to develop, no question. It will probably take a long way to get there. And at the moment, we also have a lot of poor policies, we have to say. But we cannot blame carbon for all the poor policies. It's all poor politics that lead to poor policies. But I think that's the way we would have to go.
Oh, it's me?
Hila?
Yes. Well, I think we should really take it seriously when World Bank representatives say that within the climate policy and the global climate governance, we are actually re-engineering the world economy in a way that has never been done before. It's simultaneously. It's synchronic, So I urge the people who are watching this chat that take their own conclusions. You can go to the UN portal and see what is defined and what has been inscribed as climate action. You can look at the Green Climate Fund and see with your own eyes to what kind of projects the money is going. You can look very carefully in the next 12 months in the process towards the next CBD meeting, the COP in China next year. What is about this new deal for nature? This idea of creating or establishing a target of 30% of terrestrial and marine ecosystems as climate stabilization zones. It's important also to look what will come out of this UN Climate Action Summit next October in New York. Because for the people who have a little bit of a critical thinking, you will see that what we are facing, it's this new form of governance, of environmental governance, that I would not say it's democratic. I'm sorry. I see it more as it's the paving the way for a technocracy that worries me a lot. It's very autocratic. We are going to have in a very short while to dispute not with politicians, but with algorithms and artificial intelligence. And human nature and human societies do not have this experience. We have nothing as we are as to compare to what we are leading to. And I find it very dangerous that we keep with this technocratic talks and with all this jargon, and we are not looking at the power dimension that is involved. Once we accept the carbon metrics to define how our relationship with nature will be, we will be hostage of this, because this is being automated in a very wide technological infrastructure. So I think this is a conversation that needs to be continued, but I think each one of you should really dig deep and see what is entailed in this package that is not visible at first hand.
Perfect. Well, thank you all for that final comment, drawing onto the solutions and what we need to do. And thank you, Camila, for inviting the audience to action, so that we know that we can see things ourselves and we don't need to wait for experts to tell us. The tools are there. We just need to use them. So finally, I would just like to, before you can do final comments to close our digital summit, I'm just going to wrap up a few of the points that we touched today. So we see that the carbon-centered narrative has been somewhat useful for communication, but in a context that has been very, you could say, colonialist. Even when we think about carbon markets and the whole RED program, it was mainly designed with the idea that measuring and algorithms can work at the global scale, and this is not necessarily true. In Europe, because the capacity is there, they can work quite well, also because there is not as much inequalities as in the global south. But then we saw that when we move into Brazil and Mexico, these well-intentioned ideas on carbon markets and reforestation is not necessarily benefiting those who need it the most. Also, it is very encouraging to me to hear that we need this system change, because we've seen with the whole youth movement, the Fridays for the Future, the main discourse is that we need a system change. And it's encouraging to hear that people with much more expertise and with a longer trajectory than us youth think the same. And I really hope that we can move forward on with the system change, even though we know that it's not something easy and it requires the effort of everybody, and that is sometimes difficult. But it's also very good to know, as Natalie said, that we are moving forward in the right directions. There are new global initiatives that are coming up. For example, the nature-based solutions, which is going to be discussed in the previous high-level summits. And finally, that also indigenous and local knowledge is being taken into account, which, as we saw throughout the summit, is very important, because if you design a policy and a program in a place that is very far away with people that are very good with theory, once you want to ground it, there can be unintended negative consequences. So taking into account local knowledge is very important. And well, that is my wrap up. If I missed any points that you think should be emphasized, I invite you speakers to do your final remarks, and then we will finish our digital summit. We can start with Camila again.
No, thank you very much for the whole setup. I think it's very important to have this kind of debate among people that not necessarily think in the same way. I like diversity, and I believe in dialogue, and I think this is the way to move forward. And I'm really hopeful that the youth movement that is so much eager for system change address again history, not storytelling, but history. Because history, and especially recent history, has a lot to teach us. And I think it's important to go back and to learn what has happened since the end of the Cold War that has brought us here. And because this year is the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, I think it's going to be very timely to address what is the world that we have created since that.
Jürgen?
Really not much more to add. I think I've made my points on these themes in the discussion. I also really much appreciated this interesting discussion. For me, it was the first time to be on this kind of forum, so an interesting experience. Also with regards to sharing different views. I might just add that for those of you who are interested, at the University of Freiburg, we actually do offer a continuing education course in carbon forestry, where all these things are being discussed, a 3-week block module where lots of interesting people from all over the world converge to debate this and learn about all the different aspects that we've discussed also here today. So check us out at University Freiburg Carbon Forestry.
Perfect. If you want to add the link on the column on the right-hand side, feel free to do so. If not, we can add it to your bio later, and whoever watches the digital summit later can have an access to the link. And Natalie, I think she had to go because she did warn us before that she only had a limited amount of time. So with this, I thank you all very much for being here today and for having this very interesting conversation. I think it sparked a lot of new ideas and new critical thinking in the minds of all the audience. So finally, well, happy World Environmental Day. I hope we can do some actions today to move forward positively for nature. And well, that's it. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you to our audience for attending. And if you have any further comments or questions, please let us know. Bye-bye.
Bye.